All right, so request was made for a video on reference types versus value types, specifically about this whole equals equals test. So that's what this is trying to accomplish. So let's start with value types. And when you are talking about value types, think about primitives. So those are the things like ints and doubles and cars and things like that. So those are the things that don't take up a lot of space in memory. So right here in my code, I've got an integer x and an integer y, and they've both been assigned to the same value, 5. What's happening in my memory is I have this integer x, and it's storing a value of 5, and then I have integer y, and it's storing a value of 5. So both of these things, the integers, are actually storing exactly what we assigned them. And that's the purpose of a value type. The value type stores the actual value that we assigned it. So now when I come back to my Java then, I have my test. And I want to test, are these two value types equal using an equals equals test? What that equals equals test is going to be doing is actually looking inside of these boxes and saying, is what's inside of these boxes, is that the same in both cases? So it's kind of looking in that first box that's assigned to the variable. So when I run that, I should get true, and that's what this true is telling me right here. And actually, just for the sake of it, let's get rid of some of this stuff just for the time being. So we don't have to see it all the time. All right, so now when I run this test, I get true. That's what I was expecting because I'm comparing what's inside the box of x, which is 5, and inside the box of y, which is 5. Now, in terms of a dot equals wouldn't exist for this, and Java doesn't like me. And the reason why is because this is a primitive type, this is a value type, and Java knows that the dot equals method is really written for objects or reference types. So it already knows that this isn't a reference type, and I can't run that test. So in terms of value types, you never really have to worry about which type of test to run. You're limited to the equals equals test because you're only able to compare what's inside these first boxes. So now then, let's consider what happens when we have a reference type. And a reference type think about those as being all of the objects that we're working with. So any kind of an object is a reference type. So let's see what I did here is I started with a string A, which I wrote to be equal, and then I created two substrings from that. And the reason why I have to do it this way is because Java is actually kind of smart, and Java would know if I created two identical strings and it tries to be efficient. So just to prove my point, I had to create some substrings that were different and that Java didn't necessarily think were the same. So in Java's memory then, what we did is we created two strings. I created string B, which the initial box, what string B is storing, what this variable is actually storing is this arrow, this address that takes me to the string qual. String C, which is also a substring, does something very similar. It creates a completely different arrow, and that different arrow is pointing to a different qual box. So these two things, even though they're the same, are considered two different objects. And what my variables are storing is it's storing like the arrow or the address of where those objects are. So now when you talk about reference types, instead of just having one thing stored in memory, like we did with value types, now you end up with two things stored in memory for each item. So each item has an address and then the actual object that we're trying to refer to. So when I come back to my code then, I have my two tests. The equals equals test, and what the equals equals test is going to be doing is it's going to be looking at this and saying, first boxes, are these the same? So basically it's going to be comparing these two arrows. Are these two arrows actually pointing to the same object? And we know the answer is no, because these are two different objects. Pardon the interruption. But so those are pointing to two different objects. So when I run my equals equals test, I get false. And the reason why, again, is because what the equals equals test is testing is whether or not these two arrows are basically pointing to the same object. And they're not. So Java then, since we know that string is an object, in the object class, they wrote a default dot equals method. And that dot equals method is what I used here. And that's comparing what's actually stored then inside the second boxes. So instead of comparing the arrows in the first set of boxes, the dot equals method compares what's eventually stored. It's comparing the actual objects rather than the references. So I'll say that again. So when you have the equals equals method, you're comparing references. But when you have the dot equals method with objects, you're comparing the actual objects. And we need two methods because there's two different things being stored. So when I came over here and I ran this dot equals method, I got true because what was being stored in the boxes was the exact same thing. So if I wanted to make them both be true, what I'd have to do is I'd have to make sure that they were both, string B and string C, were actually pointing to the same object. So let's take a look at my code here, and what would happen then if I just said that C equals B. So now what I'm doing is I'm reassigning. I said instead of string C pointing to this object, let me reassign it to point to the same thing that B is pointing to. I didn't actually take this and smash it into that box. This box is still here in the memory. It's just that now no one's pointing to it. So now if I look at it, the equals equals test will be testing to see if these two arrows are pointing to the same object, and they are. And the dot equals test is going to be testing if this object is the same as itself, essentially. And we know that should be true. So now we'll save and we'll run, and now I get true, true. So long story short, when you're doing objects or reference types, keep in mind that there's two things being stored. The equals equals test is testing whether or not they're referring to the same object. It doesn't matter what's stored inside the object at all. And the dot equals method is then what's going to be testing whether or not what's inside the objects is actually identical.